Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here this morning. As you all think about your role relative to state and local government, one of the biggest challenges in our society is dealing with what's going to happen as a result of artificial intelligence. And it is good news and bad news. The good news is it will transform the world's economy, and the order of magnitude is trillions and trillions of dollars. The bad news is it will disrupt the jobs of tens of millions, if not hundreds of millions, of people across the globe over the coming decades. Those two phenomenon pose giant challenges for all of society and especially for government. So what I'd like to do this morning is to talk about the opportunities and the challenges and to give you some hints, suggestions, observations from what we learned at the Little Hoover Commission in our work. And just a quick story. I was chatting with one of the following speakers about what's going on in California, and I said, well, how is California doing in terms of procurement? And the conversation quickly went to wildfires. Well, it happens that the Little Hoover Commission had actually done a study on wildfires. And towards the end of our conversation about wildfires and forest management, the subject of artificial intelligence actually merged with wildfires. And that didn't make a lot of sense to some of my fellow commissioners. But the opportunity to use technology to detect dry kindling that could produce fires was an important component of what we ended up talking about, and how to prevent, detect, and react to wildfires. So why is it that artificial intelligence is relevant? If you think about it in a kind of profound way, take everything that you can do that can be chopped into zeros and ones. There's a lot of stuff there. A lot of decisions, a lot of data that can guide decisions. And so understanding the world of artificial intelligence has to be one of the foremost obligations of elected and professional staff in state and local government. So I'm going to go through some slides. Route 50, I appreciate their having this forum. People want the slides, they're in the public domain. The comments I'm going to make are kind of a mixture of our report and a little bit of personal commentary. There are only 9 slides, so you don't have to take a lot of notes. So the first is, what is artificial intelligence? I've got a bunch of different definitions. The one that I kind of like is automation on steroids. That's easy to understand because it's not that many words. I have another definition that comes from actually a friend of mine who runs a think tank. He said AI is a branch of computer science devoted to creating computer systems that perform tasks characteristic of human intelligence, such as learning and decision making. That's a pretty comfortable kind of pedestrian decision. There's another way of thinking about this, and it's important to make the distinction. That is, there is artificial narrow intelligence and artificial general intelligence. The scary part is the artificial general intelligence. Some of you are old enough to remember Kubrick's film 2001, A Space Odyssey, and Hal, the computer who takes things over. That's kind of artificial general intelligence. It's things that are beyond human. At least human, but oftentimes beyond. Artificial narrow intelligence is pretty straightforward because guess what? You use it every day. I am willing to bet that a substantial number of you use Siri, Netflix, Amazon, online travel planning. That's all powered by algorithms that are set up to do things to help perform a human-like function. So AI is here, it's not coming. And that's an important thing to understand. Demystifying the topic of AI is a part of the obligation of what it's like to be a leader, and especially in government and technology. So those of you who want to learn more about all this, 3 resources. One, Andrew Ng, that's NG, has a free course on Coursera. I get no money from this. It's 4 hours long. He's really good. It's easy to do. You can do it in 6 or 7 minute increments. I would start there. Second, if you want to get a sense of the order of magnitude of how much change is going to occur, then Kai-Fu Lee, who used to be the head of Google in China, has written a book called AI Superpowers. It's accessible, it's not technical. And those of you who want to dive into a specific topic, my friend Eric Topol has a new book out called Deep Medicine, which is really good because he describes AI, at least as it applies to health, but he does it in a way that makes it accessible and actually inviting. Eric is a cardiologist by training, and his point, the reason for the title of his book, is technology can free people up to be empathetic and to make a human connection. That partnership between machine and man is a key component of what we would hope people would aspire to do. This is not about the robot that ate Cleveland. This is not about destroying society as we know it. But along the way, government is going to have to make a series of choices. So what are the opportunities? Think of literally everything that government does. Processing information for the Department of Motor Vehicles. Where does somebody go to renew their driver's license? Well, you could have a sign that would say DMV. You could have a listing in the white pages and the yellow pages. Maybe you have a website. That all sounds pretty straightforward. What if you knew where everybody who was waiting in line was in line at every DMV in a geographic area, and you could tell people where to go and how long it was going to take them to get their driver's license? That can't be facilitated unless you have data and the technological capability of doing it. What if instead of that, somebody contacted you by email, telephone, some other text, to tell you that your driver's license is about to expire and how to do it and how to use the system, and to do it in a way that's understandable? That would be another use of AI. So you can think of lots and lots of examples. The more interesting examples I'll get to in a while are using AI for social good. The biggest challenge, and the one that I want to focus on the most, is the role of AI relative to the workforce. There are lots of estimates. There's kind of I won't call it bogus, the often misleading statistic from a study by Oxford University that 47% of all jobs are going to be adversely influenced by artificial intelligence. Well, that's precisely wrong. How you could make it 47, not 50, I have no idea. But what they really said was the individual discrete activities of jobs would be influenced. So if you're an accountant, counting things can be done by a machine. Thinking about a strategy has to be done by a person. So the job of an accountant who is involved in strategic planning is going to change. And there may be fewer accountants, but the ones who remain may be higher paid, may have a different job title. So thinking about the challenges, how are we going to prepare the workforce? And I'm going to go to a slide that's actually at the very end of my presentation, because the graphic is how do we spend our money training the workforce today? You don't need to look at all the numbers on the bottom or the top, other than the blue stuff is we spend money between very young children and age 25. That's almost all of the money. But in the evolving age of automation and artificial intelligence, we ought to be spending the same amount of money between 25 and 70, training, retraining, improving the skills of workers, because jobs are going to change, and they're going to change more rapidly. We as a society, we as government, are not remotely prepared to do this. High schools aren't, community colleges aren't, universities aren't, employers are not prepared. How are we going to deliver all those things? Some of that's going to come from technological breakthroughs. California now has an online community college. That's good, but that's not remotely enough. So one of the biggest challenges is really, how do you deal with the workforce? And part of the reason that I stress that is there is a palpable fear that jobs are going to be destroyed, and that produces oftentimes a retrenchment, a desire to preserve. So politically, in the legislature or in an executive branch, people will say, I don't want any change. I don't want to use any automation. Well, that might actually work temporarily until you discover that whoever's doing that is no longer competitive in a global environment. So if the United States banned robots, robots would continue to be made in China and in Japan and Germany, and their economies would get stronger because they'd be more efficient. The cost of their goods would go down, they would sell more, and it would be adverse to American interests. So if you don't include workers in the conversation and give them an opportunity to feel like they've got a stake in the future, that their skills and their understanding of AI and automation is going to enable them to have a good and positive life, that kind of negative reaction, fear of the unknown, is going to be a problem. So one of the other opportunities for AI, which I think is profound, is the opportunity to use AI to achieve some social good. I'll give you a couple examples. There are lots more. In fact, I had a slide in here that I took out because it was too hard to read, because it was 16 topics with 4 bullets under each one. It was an eye chart. McKinsey did a really good report on this. I'll give you some examples. If you want to promote renewable energy, okay, what does that mean? Wind and solar. Well, that's intermittent. Well, that irregularity needs to be addressed. The best way to do it is to figure out usage patterns. Where is energy being consumed? What kind of energy is needed? And that's all math. That's zeros and ones. And figuring out a pattern of how to meter and how to distribute energy is a social good. Another example is in the field of medicine. Pathologists review slides. They review x-rays, they review MRIs. What if some machine told them which ones they should review first? The pathologist comes in the morning and he wants to know, oh, I've got 400 slides I've got to review. I'll just start on number 1. It would be better if he or she started by looking at people who had a pulmonary embolism risk. So you put those on top. Well, guess what? That's happening today. There is now technology which is pretty close to being able to be useful that's going to permit a machine to tell the pathologist, you really need to look at this one because we, the machine, are 95% confident that it is this disease or this condition. So pathologists and their job is going to become quite different. Maybe there are fewer of them, but from a patient point of view, the results will be faster and more accurate. So that's a social good. So the opportunity to use technology to advance some fundamental human aspiration is a good thing. The other points on this slide, I've talked a little bit about improved decision-making. Governor Newsom, who of all the public officials I've met with since Al Gore, when I worked for him, Governor Newsom gets it. He understands technology. He understands the role of technology in the delivery of government services, and I think he's going to be a profoundly positive effect on the state government, on procurement, and on technology policy. So he's appointed a commission on the future of work. Some would argue it should be not the future of work, it should be work in the future, because there will always be work. You don't want to have it as a pregnant question. So he's appointed 3 very impressive leaders to look at these employment questions and to try and come up with a series of policies. Their initial report is due next February. So that's an important initiative worth tracking. So we talked about education. Another challenge for government is how do you make sure that the human values and ethical considerations are part of what's going on? So I'm just going to use San Francisco as a microcosm. Those of you who are from San Francisco will know the Board of Supervisors passed a resolution opposing the use of facial recognition in law enforcement. I can understand that. There is actually a good case that sometimes facial recognition can be useful in preventing the misidentification of a suspect in a criminal case, because witness identification is more often wrong. Does that 10 minutes mean 10 minutes to go or 10 minutes finished? Okay. So San Francisco's already done something on facial recognition. I have a new iPhone. It uses facial recognition as opposed to a passcode. It's really convenient. I don't have to remember anything. I don't have to poke things around. I just hold it up. That technology can be used for good, but it can also be abused. So one of the ethical challenges is how do you deal with the data, or technical term, data sets? What's the input? And then who's writing the programs? Well, that's a question of transparency and accountability. There's some studies that suggest, gee, there are a lot of men writing programs. It's overwhelmingly male, most often not people of color, and that's a risk. You can end up with, use an example from if you said, well, let's not count race, let's measure whether there's criminal behavior by zip code. Well, that could become a surrogate for race, depending on the degree of housing segregation. Well, somebody who says, oh, we're taking race out of the equation because there's no code for that, if they didn't get the racial segregation component and they're a white male, they would be making a bias mistake. So some, including the European Union, have said, hey, we've got to have transparency. New York City passed a resolution saying we've got to mandate transparency. There are some risks with that. What if the transparency is the details of an algorithm that no one understands? Well, that's not very helpful. And if you dumb it down so that it's understandable, it's probably going to be misleading. So how do you deal with that? You probably have to have some new form of disclosure. There are risks in decision-making. If it's centralized at the governmental level, it could become too cumbersome, too rule-constricted, not permit change and adaptation. So all of these questions are going to be, what's the right analogy? But at bottom, it's going to be, what are the right values? The values of personal autonomy, privacy, transparency, accountability. And each of you is going to play a role in helping elected officials and others reach conclusions about this. So my second San Francisco example, this morning's newspaper, the district attorney of San Francisco decided to not code for race in making charging decisions. And he's using technology from Stanford University. At a first blush, that sounds like a good thing, because there's some evidence that he's reacting to, that there've been a risk of bias in charging decisions in San Francisco. But until you know what the details are, you're not going to really be able to figure out whether it's fair, and you're not going to be able to figure out if it works. So the government plays an important role in setting policy, but it's got to start with an articulation of values. So going back to the education and training point that I made before, figuring out how to create jobs that are useful requires that you make projections about what's going to happen in the future. And I think it was Yogi Berra who said, predicting the future is hard. He said a lot of famous things. But a big part of it is getting diversity in the workforce. Right now, there are an insufficient number of women going into coding and certain technology fields. Government has an important role in doing that. And if you think about it, the same thing applies in terms of diversity. One of the other opportunities that you all have as government officials is to think about the data that you have, and is it an asset? I would submit that it is a giant asset. If data is the new gold, then the opportunity to use, mine, and put into the public domain useful information is pretty profound. So the Obama administration had an open data initiative. The state of California has done some things. If you think about homelessness in California, the state collects some data on homelessness, but they have not fully integrated in a geospatial system sense. Where are homeless people located geographically? What's the demographic mix? What's their housing situation? What's their health situation? The other social determinants of health, education level, drug use, access to mental health care. You can use data to create an entire program of thinking about this. And so one of the things that I believe Governor Newsom is going to do in his focus on homelessness is use data that the state and local governments already possess. And somebody has to go through the data, clean it, and make it appropriate for decision making. Cities and counties have to do the same thing if they want to offer a high quality service. And Little Hoover also wrote another report about government services, and the title was Technology, How to Make Government Citizen-Centric. So if you're an average consumer of government services, you shouldn't have to know the name of the department of government who is doing that service. You should be able to use plain English to access what's going on. And you should be able to ask plain English questions and get answers in real time that's useful. And the people who are managing that process should be able to assess what kinds of queries they're getting by using machine learning, plain language interpretation, to get data to figure out whether they're doing what they should be doing, which is effectively communicating. So if you think about data, think of it as an asset. You are the stewards of this gigantic asset, and using it wisely is a primary responsibility of government. So some other opportunities. I think the subsequent panel is going to talk about procurement, so I'm going to skip that one. And we talked about examples of the government as regulator. The one that I want to call out, and it's going to seem a little off topic, right now there's a big debate in the California legislature about a court case called Dynamex and whether to apply it to every employment situation in the state. Think Uber and Lyft drivers. Are they employees or independent contractors? That's a big question. In a gig economy, government, just like all of the private sector, is going to end up with people, human beings who are going to have jobs that are less than full-time. And the employment model will be, how do they get their benefits, how portable their benefits are, and what kind of rights and responsibilities do they have vis-a-vis their employer. Whether government is doing that themselves or enforcing wage and hour laws, benefits, et cetera. The evolution of work, which is going to be impacted by automation and artificial intelligence, is going to require that we rethink training, how the workplace, these rights and responsibilities are allocated, and how government can set policy. So I'm going to conclude there, and I'd be glad to answer a couple questions and then turn it back to the Route 50 people. Thank you. Okay, burning questions. Yes, ma'am.
And if you just wait for the microphone to record.
All right, so my biggest question about AI is that, like you said, there were fears around AI and how people are going to lose employment and all that stuff. But my biggest question to me is that there is no regulation about AI.
I'm sorry?
Regulations, like it's not regulated. I mean, in China, you can go to China, and I'm looking at this video about Sophia. I don't know if any of you know about Sophia, right? Sophia was actually a Texas company that moved to China and built Sophia basically in China, right? Because over here we have certain rules that we need to follow. And yet, you know, this artificial intelligence thing, we have no governance, we have no policies, like you said. I mean, I look at your presentation, it's like all about policies and stuff like that. But don't you think that the policy needs to come from not just the local, but it needs to come from the top?
Yeah, if I can just summarize the question so that everybody is on the same page. Public policy is complicated. Yes, it's good that local governments try to do this, but doesn't it have to be a national policy decision, especially in a competitive global economy?
Right. Exactly.
Okay? I think that's a fair point. But let me use as an example, we had a workshop at the Little Hoover Commission, and we brought in various stakeholders, business organizations, and organized labor. And there are 3.5 million truck drivers in the United States. It's a highly paid, highly compensated occupation. Some would say, oh, all those jobs are going to be eliminated by autonomous vehicles, trucks. And the Teamsters came in, and I'm paraphrasing them, not so fast. It may well be that trucks moving from a location near Dallas to San Jose are autonomous. But there's going to be a human being on board who's essentially a planner, inventory manager, and facilitation of the loading of the goods onto the truck, the unloading of the goods, dealing with snafus along the way. The person may not physically be driving, they may be doing something else. So how do you create a set of rules around truck drivers who are no longer driving the truck? That's hard. Somebody has to think through, where are we today, where are we likely to be in the future, and how quickly can we adapt to this degree of change? And your other implicit question of how do we compete with China, I think that's very difficult because they have many more data points, a larger population. They have, for example, currently, if you order something in China, food delivery, it's in the main delivered within 30 minutes for 70 cents. That's all facilitated by AI. And guess what? Their payment system is not a bank or a check. It isn't even a credit card. It's a mobile payment system. So they're able to track who's ordering, what their credit history is, and how do you effectively improve the routing of somebody so that you can get it there in 30 minutes. And how do you drive down that 70 cents? You hire millions of food delivery people on the cheapest, most efficient scooters possible. So we're not close to that with DoorDash or Uber Eats or anything like that in the United States. So they may well have some advantages because they have access to greater data. What they don't have, at least up to now, is the basic R&D activity from AI, which until now has come from the United States and to a lesser extent Canada and the United Kingdom. The application of that technology is something that's going to have to occur both in the private sector and in government to be able to keep up with the pace of change in China. Other questions? Yes, sir. Yeah.
Thank you. Very interesting remarks, thank you. So, yourself being an investor.
It's true.
So where do you predict, what industry or sector do you predict will have the biggest gains, the biggest value creation due to the AI revolution?
If I knew that, I wouldn't be here. Let me take the one field that I know the most about, which is healthcare. There are literally a ton of companies seeking to use AI, and I'll just divide it roughly into three categories. There are many more. AI and electronic medical or health records, AI and pathology, which I referenced before, and AI for drug discovery. The pathology example I gave you, because it's real, is the closest. Is that a big segment of the market? No. But it's likely to come sooner. AI and electronic medical records, the key rate-limiting step is reading doctors' notes. And electronic health records are now more prevalent in the United States than they were when Congress passed the Affordable Care Act and added a lot of money in the Recovery Act to spiff up EHRs. But they're still junky and difficult to use. So I'm in the board of a hospital. We want to use AI in electronic health records. It's going to be a while. AI in drug discovery, really complicated. Probably the longest period of time. But there's a front page story in the San Francisco Chronicle this morning. A friend of mine who teaches and works at UCSF created a company, and they did a deal with GlaxoSmithKline on the use of genome editing, CRISPR-Cas9, with artificial intelligence. That's like science fiction, but I have confidence that they're going to be able to do that and figure out how to target a particular drug using genome editing. Whether the drug works will be 5 or 10 years from now. So you sort of have to take whatever the sector is and chop it into bits and then figure out what's the most useful. And the more advanced companies in a sector are going to be ones who can figure out how to do machine learning. That is, think of the board game Go. If you haven't seen the movie AlphaGo, it's actually quite a good documentary. And Google's DeepMind is trying to compete with the world's best Go player. And Go is thought to be 1,000 or 10,000 times more complicated than chess. No one thought that was possible. Well, guess what? The machine beat the man. But that required 3 years of data input. And eventually, the big leap was they gave data to the machine and didn't tell the machine what the rules were. And what the machine decided was, you don't have to win by a touchdown. You have to win by 1 point. So the machine played the game not to crush the opponent or to get a particular margin or to beat the Las Vegas odds. They just played to win. And that was something the machine figured out that humans hadn't. So the machine learning concept when you get to that stage, you're probably going to have a big jump forward in whatever the sector of technology is. So, want to give time for the others? Thank you very much.